Franciscan Charism. I'm going to go through various aspects of the Charism and how important it was for the Capuchins to begin their reform in the 16th century and somehow try to reach back to Francis and positively institutionalize the life of Francis. Part of the Franciscan struggle had been somehow reining in Francis and making it livable for each and every individual friar. Remember, the rule was only 12 chapters long, which consisted of maybe 16 paragraphs. And so you had in the beginning 7,000 friars trying to be guided by these 16 paragraphs of a very short rule of life for men who were living all over the world. And so when the Capuchins began their reform in the 16th century, they were trying to somehow bring together and bring a conformity, a unity to the life in such a way that each and every friar, when observing the rule of Francis, would be faithful to the rule in all things and faithful to the spirit of Francis in all things. And so the Capuchins had a very heavy emphasis on prayer, so that's what we're going to begin with. They were able to positively, once again, institutionalize Francis's contemplative spirit. And so the first thing I want to talk about today is the Capuchin silence and solitude. Our Capuchin forefathers said, nothing is more profitable to the environment of prayer than silence, and nothing is so little esteemed as silence. Without silence, we cannot hear God. You know, it's funny that St. John of the Cross was the one who said that God's first language is silence. If you've seen the Fishers and Men video about the priesthood, there's one of the Sisters of Life who speaks in the video, and she says that everything grows in silence. Even the human person grows in silence. The child in the womb grows in silence. And not only do our physical bodies grow in silence, but it is also true to say that our soul grows in silence. Our intimacy with God grows in silence. Our union with God grows in silence. Noise preoccupies the sense of hearing and doesn't allow us to filter that which is not of God. Let me say that again. Noise preoccupies the sense of hearing and does not allow us to filter that which is not of God. Hearing is the one sense that we cannot automatically shut down. Even though we may not hear things while we are sleeping, our brain is still registering the noise around us. And if the noise is loud enough, we will wake up. Well, most of us, if we're not throwing our alarm clock across the room. They say that the hearing is the last sense to go. I know when I was a hospital chaplain, they always talked about the fact that the last sense was your hearing, and people in a coma or who are dying, were not able to respond, were in fact able to hear. And they got this from those who had woken up out of comas and said they were able to hear everything going on around them. And so we know that hearing is a very powerful, powerful sense that we just can't automatically shut off. And so in the world, we like to listen to many things, right? We like to listen to conversation. We like to listen to music. We spend millions upon millions of dollars on sound quality products, high definition speakers, woofers and tweeters, bass amps and equalizers. We want to hear well when listening on the phone or listening to music or watching a movie. We want to hear what is going on. If anybody's ever watched a movie with me, they know I get very annoyed when people start talking through the movie because I like to hear what's going on in the movie and not the conversation around me. I was once in a theater and the movie was happening and a guy started snoring in the middle of the movie. And I didn't say anything, but the lady in front of us turned around and said, "Hey, will somebody shut him up?" So we like to hear what's going on the screen, right? So much time and so much money is spent on hearing each other, music and such. But so little effort is put into creating the environment to listen to God. We put such little emphasis or effort into creating an environment where we can listen to God. How much effort do I put into quieting my exterior environment, right? We have to ask ourselves that question. How much time do we put into, putting that quiet on the exterior environment? Shutting off the YouTube channel, not going to Facebook perhaps, shutting the music off in the car. How much energy and time do we put into creating an environment of exterior quiet? And then we have to ask ourselves also, how often do I seek noise? Do I seek the company of others? How often am I looking for people to talk to? Right? We get that uncomfortability with silence when we're by ourselves. We start looking for others to talk to because there's an insecurity that we have in being alone. And the question comes down, am I comfortable in silence? Am I comfortable in the midst of silence? So I'm not just speaking about exterior noise here. I'm also speaking about the noise of the interior noise, the silence of the mind. Let's start there. Have I stilled the operations of my mind? Right? What are the operations of the mind? The imagination, the intellect, thoughts, memory. They can be very active and very noisy. I have a very active imagination. Other people have very active intellect, or their thoughts just keep going, or memories just keep coming up. Have we had the ability to still and quiet the imagination, the intellect, the thoughts, and the memory? Not that God can't speak through these faculties. In fact, he does. Part of the practices of St. Ignatius of Loyola is the use of the imagination, right? Certainly discursive meditation is the use of the memory and the imagination and so forth. But at the same time, have I stilled them to actually be able to hear what the Lord God is saying? Are they drowning God out, or are they being vehicles of God's voice is the question. Which is it? And then we speak of silence of the heart. Have I stilled the faculties of my heart? In particular, fears, worries, anxieties, concerns, all those emotions that go on down inside. We get quiet. We're starting to pray, and all these various emotions can start going, on within ourselves, that it disrupts the silence, it disrupts the quiet, and doesn't give us the freedom to hear God's voice. And once again, God can be speaking through them. He can be speaking very powerfully through them. But if I still them to the point where they are not impeding the voice of God, but are being vehicles for the voice of God. See the difference? The difference between a vehicle and the difference between an obstacle. An obstacle blocks the path. The vehicle creates the path or assists in the carrying forth of the message of the Word of God. And then we speak of silence of the soul, a quieting of the constant preoccupations of this or that thing. Or I should say the spiritual things. You always get these people who are trying to judge where they are in the spiritual life. They start reading Teresa of Avila. I'm in the third mansion, I'm in the fourth mansion, am I in a unitive way? Am I in the dark night of the soul, or the dark night of the senses? Where am I on the journey? And they get so preoccupied and lost in the journey that they actually forget about the journey. And then there's also scrupulosity, which could set in. We're worried about how are we praying? Are we praying well? Are we praying the right things? What am I praying? Should I be doing discursive meditation? Should I be doing Lectio Divina? Should I be doing the stillness of that soul that allows itself to enter into and be embraced by the ever-living God? Creating a silent environment is scriptural and in the lives of the saints. The scriptures speak more about the sins of the tongue than any other sin. And no one is more firm on this than St. James, right? St. James tells us that with our tongues we bless God and we curse our neighbor. He said the tongue is like a rudder on the ship. It's such a small part of the ship, but it directs the whole ship. He said the man who can control his tongue, that truly is a just man. I got a long way to go with that, right? Our Lord tells us that for every idle word we speak, we shall render an account. For every idle word we speak, we shall render an account. Boy, if we counted up our idle words in a day, there's a lot of accounting to do, right? So we look at some of the prophets, the two great prophets of the old that sought God in the silence on the mountain. Let's look at two of them. First being Elijah. Remember Elijah, after he slays the prophets of Baal, he goes up to Mount Carmel and he goes to listen for God. And there's the earthquake, and then there's the storm, there's the wind and the rain, and God's not there, God's not there. And finally, it's in a small, still voice that he hears God. When everything's quiet, when everything's still, when he's still, He just came from a very, emotional event where he slew a couple hundred people, and the queen was after him. When he got up to that mountain, there was a lot of disturbance. When he was still and all was still, then he could hear God's voice. Look to Moses. Moses would speak to God face to face as one man speaks to another. He would speak to him in the silence of the meeting tent as well. So there was this quiet between Moses and God in their conversation and their discussions together. So we even see these two great prophets meeting with Jesus on Mount Tabor, speaking with Jesus. And then they talk about our Lord's passion. But both Moses and Elijah went to the mountain into the silence to speak to God and to listen and hear his voice in silence. So besides the multitude of saints we can look to who fled the world or worldly environments, among them some of the greatest of apostolic men, we look to our own seraphic father, St. Francis, who loved silence and solitude. On the way back from having the rule approved, the friars were discussing whether they should be hermits and given over to silence and prayer. Isn't that interesting? Here they were, they got their rule approved, they go and they visit the Pope. The Pope approves the rule on the way home. They're talking about being hermits and giving themselves over to solitude. At the end of the discussion, they decide that they should be active. They should be proclaiming the gospel. However, they also knew they had to be men of contemplation, men of deep prayer. We see this when they get to St. Mary's of the Angels. They leave the Rivo Torto and they move to the Poziuncula. And the first thing they did was they built solitary huts surrounding the chapel. Now, some would believe that they did this because they had all been living in one small hut together, the 12 of them. And so when they got to St. Mary's of the Angels, they're like, hey, I'm going to build my own little hut. Me too. And they just built these little 12 huts around, They probably were tired of all living in one big room. Now, that's probably the human part of it. But the spiritual part of that reality is that they were going to go and create these small huts surrounding the chapel where they could enter into quiet prayer, alone with God, in that silence and in that solitude. They first built solitary huts surrounding the chapel. And St. Francis imposed a strict silence on the friary. We read this in the Mirror of Perfection. Francis built a hedge around the friary property, so he created this cloister wall of hedges. And there were the hermitages, the chapel, then there was the house where they met, and the house where they ate in, and together in community. And Francis wanted this to be a place of silence, where silence and solitude was protected. And he wanted this as the model to every single friary. When our Capuchin forefathers were building their friaries outside the city, what we call the hermitage friaries, they were intentionally building them outside because they wanted them to be places of prayer. They intentionally wanted them to be modeled after the Poziuncula. And all the early friars were built outside the cities and towns. And after Francis's death, many large friaries were built in cities, and the hermitages were abandoned. And this was seen as an abandoning of Francis's original intent. And it was a great source of anxiety for the whole order. To know the heart of St. Francis and his thoughts on solitude and silence, we only need to look at how much he himself spent in solitude, how much time he spent in solitude. We think about all of his trips to Mount Laverna, where he received the stigmata. We look at Greccio, when he would spend the 40 days there in preparation for Easter. Another time we spent the 40 days in prayer in preparation for Christmas. Or the great island where he made a Lent there for 40 days where he ate nothing except a half a loaf of bread. These weren't just 3 moments in his life, but there were several moments in his life of his year that he would spend in silence and quiet and solitude. He loved the quiet. He loved the solitude. He even battled a lot about whether or not he himself should be a hermit and give himself over to solitude. It was such a draw in his heart. He had this pull within himself, the pull to go and do apostolic work and to preach, and the pull to go to hermitage and to go into solitude. Our early Capuchin reformers were able to positively institutionalize the silence and solitude of St. Francis. One of the hallmarks of the Capuchin reform is the institutionalization of the contemplative aspect of the Franciscan charism. Let me say that again. One of the hallmark of the Capuchin reform is the institutionalization of the contemplative aspect of the Franciscan charism. Poverty, minority, and penance being other aspects, but primary among all of them was the contemplative dimension of the life. Contemporary reformers miss this essential aspect. We're not monks, and so we should not be monks. It's not a matter of a series of vocal prayers, rattling off our mouths as we make a holy hour. And we see that there's many of these Franciscan/Carmelite communities. You meet some new communities where they want to be Carmelites and be contemplative, but yet they want to be active, so they want to be Franciscan. So they have this pull, like they're riding two different horses. You see these Franciscans wearing Carmelite scapulars and say, well, we're Carmelite Franciscan. We're Carmelite in our prayer life, but we're Franciscan in our service of the poor and our preaching. Well, quite honestly, we call that Capuchin, because that's what the Capuchins were. They were contemplatives, strong contemplatives, but they were also strong in the apostolate. They had the perfect balance between the two. There's a contemporary view of Francis that he was all apostolic, that he was out there all the time preaching, all the time working with the poor. He did those things, but he had more time that was dedicated to prayer, to solitude and silence, than it was given over to the ministry and the apostolate. That's a fact about his life. Our contemporaries wanted to see him simply as the apostolic guy serving the poor. Now, they didn't do that, but that was not the fullness of his life. It's looking at Francis through a contemporary prism, perhaps through the Jesuit model, where the apostolate is first, secondary, comes then prayer and so forth. Where Franciscans, the primacy is prayer, and the apostolate falls down lower in the rung of priority. So the contemplative structure that our early Capuchins built, there were 2 hours of silent prayer, communal. It wasn't like you go make your holy hour, you go make your hour, then I'll make my second hour, then you go make your second hour. There were 2 communal hours that they would spend together in the chapel in silent prayer. And they said this was for the lukewarm. So if you were lukewarm, this was the minimal. So it was expected that you would do actually more than what was required of you in those 2 hours. It wasn't 1 hour or 2 half-hour periods or 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, 20 minutes after that. It was a priority. And the priority was on the contemplative. The priority was on those 2 hours in community that was seen as an incredible, important part of the life, not an addendum, not something one gets to later on. It was structurally part of who they were. And they say in the constitutions that the true friar minor prays all the time. However, these 2 hours were given for the lukewarm. The early Capuchins also instituted silence throughout the friary. When they were to speak, it was to be with a soft, modest voice. This is written into the constitutions, and we see it whenever we read any of the early documentation on the life of the friars. That they were very strict about the silence. Why? Because they needed to respect their own need to hear God and to respect their brother's need to hear God. There wasn't radios in the room blasting, and if there were radios at the time, they wouldn't have used them. There weren't TVs in the TV room, and if they had them, they wouldn't have had them. Remember how upset Padre Pio got when they've got the TV into the friary in San Giovanni Rotondo. He was very upset about it because he knew it would take away from prayer, would take away from the community and so forth. And anyway, so it was silence throughout the friary. And then they had this emphasis on one cell, the bedroom. Your cell is your hermitage, kind of a pseudo-chapel. When Jesus said, when you pray, go to your room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. And so the Capuchins were emphasizing on that by having the cell as a place where you go alone to pray. They say one of the reasons why we have these big hoods is that when we put them up, we create ourselves a little chapel where we can be alone with God to pray, even when we're at holy hour or other times of prayer with others in prayer. So the placing of the friaries 1 or 2 miles outside the city or the town was so that they can give themselves over to prayer. So that they can give themselves over to prayer. They were 1 mile or so from the town so that they can be available to the laity, but they are 1 mile away for certain that they can be available to God in prayer. Now, being 2 miles outside of the city is hard in the United States of America because you do that and you're in the suburbs. You got to go 1 or 2 miles outside the suburbs, and if you can find a place in the quiet part. So there has to be rather creative and creating that place of prayer. And they mentioned that we should not have too much frequent interaction with seculars. We don't think of the Capuchins being that way because we know them to be so much friars of the people that it's hard to think that they would not want to have too much interaction. But the little interaction they had was so reinforced by their holiness of life that it made such an impact on others in a good way. And we'll see this later in another conference. We talk about the Capuchins in the streets. So they had not too frequent interaction with seculars. They ministered to others, but not getting caught up in their affairs. They were not attending festivals except to preach. So they weren't going out hanging out parties and all these fairs and festivals and stuff unless they were called upon to preach. And then they would show up, preach, and get home. They did their job and returned with the silence and the quiet of the friary to give themselves over to prayer and contemplation. We also see in the early Capuchins this heavy emphasis on hermitage. So there were hermitages on the property of the hermitage friaries. So let's take a step back and remember that a hermitage friary is not a group of hermits who just come together for the office and go back to their cells and someone delivers their food to them and they never speak in that sense. A hermitage friary was a friary that was outside the city, usually comprised of no more than 12 friars living in community, where they prayed together, ate together, did their 2 hours of prayer together and so forth, had recreation and so forth together, but it was outside the city. But on the property of the hermitage friaries, they had hermitages, small huts where friars could go away from the community for some time to spend that in even deeper prayer. This was especially true for the preachers, who were to retire to seclusion when they felt their spirit waning, as it says in the constitutions. They felt their spirit waning. They were to retire to the hermitages for quiet solitude and aloneness with God to be reinvigorated in the spirit. We also see the fact that in the ratio of priests to brothers, we're so used to seeing so many Capuchin priests, we forget that most Capuchins were brothers. If you had a friary of 12, the ratio in the early days was 4 priests and 8 brothers. And that was common. So it wasn't a heavy emphasis on the priestly ministry. The heavy emphasis was on the communal life of a fraternity that had priests for the necessity of the sacraments, but then also for the ministry as well of preaching. And this kept the apostolate from overrunning the contemplative life. With only having a few number of priests, it kept the life from becoming purely apostolic life. So our own legislation on prayer and its emphasis on the contemplative aspect of Franciscan life is certainly Capuchin. Besides prescriptions of particular prayers, which were written in as a means of resurrecting what was common to all religious, meaning the Angelus and so forth, there is nothing added or taken away from the Capuchin constitutions. All 7 hallmarks are contained within our own constitutions. 2 hours of silent prayer in common, silence throughout the friary, the hermitage of the cell, the location or design of the friary, the cloistered yard, infrequent interaction with seculars, emphasis on hermitage, right? Our constitutions say 4 times a year, 5 to 8 days. That's kind of our add-in, but it's respectful of that Capuchin spirituality of the hermitage and respectful of Francis, who loved hermitage. And then also the ratio of priests to brothers. When balancing our life of apostolate, fraternity, prayer, it's not a matter of equal time given to all, as if it's a third to each. A little bit to fraternity, a little bit to apostolate, and a third to prayer, as if we're balancing out with the amount of time that we give to each, right? That's not the balance. In order to maintain a balance, a much greater weight must be given to prayer. It's not a matter of 2 hours of prayer to every 2 hours of apostolate and then 2 hours of fraternity time. It's not a matter of just trying to balance it with an equal amount that's given to each. Even for the most outgoing extroverts among us, the apostolate takes much from us. Remember that St. Teresa of Avila, who was an incredible extrovert, she lost the gift of contemplation by spending too much time with seculars. She writes about it herself in her own autobiography, right? The more we are engaged in the apostolate, so much more must we be immersed and engaged in silence and contemplation of our life. And so it might be that we need to give 2/3 to prayer, and a smaller percentage to the apostolate. Because the apostolate drains us so much, it's not a matter of giving 2 to 2. It might be 4 to 2. 4 hours of prayer to 2 hours of apostolate, because the apostolates take that much. So it's the legislation, the constitutions, precepts, decrees. In protecting prayer, legislation, constitutions, precepts, and decrees are only as good as the will of those bound to obey them, right? You can have all the laws you want, all the constitutions you want, all the articles you want, all the precepts, all the decrees. They're only going to be as good as those, the goodwill of those who are bound to obey them. So if we want to protect this life of prayer, we want to protect this gift that's been given to us, we want to maintain the life that Francis has bestowed upon us in the beautiful gift of this Capuchin charism, there is a need for legislation, there's a need for constitutions, there's a need for precepts, there's a need for decrees, but they're only going to be as good as the will of those bound to obey them, right? You can have all the laws written down, and people just ignore them. And I've seen this happen in religious orders. They read the constitutions, and they're beautiful. Then you go there, and you find out they're not living them, right? That happens. It's only as good as the will of those bound to obey them. We can become very obstinate in regarding the constitutions, decrees, and precepts. We just not do it. We can be juridical, crossing every T and dotting every I, and say we've done it, kind of in a scrupulous way, worrisome over getting it done and rechecking to make sure we did it, that's another way of following the rule. But the mind, heart, soul, and will must give itself over to the contemplative life. If we're going to have that silence of heart, silence of mind, silence of body, the silence of our senses, we have the silence even with each other to hear the voice of God and respecting each other's silence, then there needs to be the gifting of self over to the contemplative life. There needs to be a peacefulness in the silence, a peacefulness with the solitude, a peacefulness with being alone before God, right? So we must make the radical choice of being persons of contemplation. Must be the radical choice of our persons to be contemplatives. The radical choice of our persons to be contemplatives. To seek silence and solitude. To desire silence and solitude. To long for silence and solitude. To choose. And to choose over and over again silence and solitude. In other words, to develop such a contemplative spirit in our hearts that we do enjoy being in community. We enjoy fraternity. We enjoy the apostolate. And when we're there. We're in the moment in the apostolate. We're in the moment in fraternity. We're in the moment when we're supposed to be where we're supposed to be, doing what we're supposed to be doing. But there should be that inner longing in the depth of our heart to seek that silence and solitude. To desire that silence and solitude. To long for the silence and solitude, to choose, and to choose over again the silence and the solitude, to be able to go away and be alone with the alone. The human person by nature wants to communicate. And this is a reflection of God, who is always communicating himself. God is the great communicator, not Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a great communicator, right? But that was his nickname, right? The great communicator. However, God himself is the great communicator, right? He spoke and hasn't stopped speaking. Nature, scripture, magisterium, silence. He's always talking. He's speaking to us in nature. He's speaking to us in scripture. He's speaking to us through the magisterium. He's speaking to us in the silence. He's speaking to us always. Too often so are we. Right? We're also always talking, right? But God's always talking, speaking to us. And to find that silence where we can allow him to be heard. So communication requires us to be listeners. Only the still, silent, and alone will hear him. The still, the silent, and alone will hear him. Stillness of our thoughts. Right? How many people say, I was thinking. Well, don't. Shh. Stillness of our hearts, calming our anxieties, our fears, our worries, concerns, calming our emotions, calming our feelings. Stillness of our imaginations, not going off to La La Land where I'm both Pope and King, right? Not going off into imagination land and all these things that can happen in our life. Calm it, quiet it, direct it. The stillness of our memories. Those memories start popping up when we're quiet. We will still the memory. Just be calm right now. Let God speak. If he wishes to speak to the memories and those things that come up, okay, but make sure it's of God and not merely a block, but actually a vehicle. And the stillness of our bodies, right? How important that is, having that stillness of our bodies. I once heard this really great speaker talk about prayer and contemplation and stillness. And he used the image of a hunter. He said, when this guy goes out hunting and he sits down, and he's waiting for the deer and he's so nervous and anxious, he's moving all the time, and he makes so much noise because he's constantly moving, listening to every, click of every stick that he's moving, and the deer don't go anywhere near him because they hear all his motions. The deer never come by. Or you have the opposite problem where he's so relaxed that he falls asleep and the deer walk right by him. He said a good hunter has his rifle and he's still and he's calm and he's focused. When he sees his deer, he waits and slowly moves, gets his target and pulls his trigger and gets his dinner. Right? See, if we're too anxious and moving in prayer, it's not good. We also have the opposite problem where we're so relaxed we go to sleep. And it requires of us to be attentive and focused, awaiting the Lord to speak and listening for the Lord to speak, to be patiently still. So listening also means being awake, as I mentioned, right? We don't want to be that the guy who falls asleep hunting and the deer goes by us. I'll say this, that it's no small fault to intentionally fall asleep on God, right? We go to prayer and we set ourselves up in such a way that we know we will fall asleep. He's attempting to speak to us and we're falling asleep on him. It's no small fault to pray in a position you know you will fall asleep in, right? It's no small fault to change positions once you have woken from sleeping in prayer, not to change positions, right? Say you fall asleep and you wake up and you stay in that place where you fall asleep and you go right back because you don't change it, And I say it's no small fault because consider how you would feel if someone came to your house at your invitation and you just intentionally fell asleep on them. How rude that would be, right? That's why I say it's no small fault. Say you woke up, say we're just overtired, so you woke up and then, you didn't do anything to change that position you were in, to stay awake, to listen to your host who's speaking to you. And so I'd say it's quite rude and quite offensive when we intentionally go to sleep. And I always use the word intentionally because sometimes we don't intentionally fall asleep. It just kind of happens at prayer. The Lord gives us a little nap. St. Teresa, little flower, St. Therese once said that she slept through a holy hour, and she said, well, St. Peter slept through his first holy hour, so I guess I'm okay, right? But to do it intentionally is the problem. So it's rude to fall asleep on someone, to think about something else when someone is speaking, right? That's rude. If someone's trying to speak to you and you're thinking of other things intentionally, I use the word intentionally because oftentimes we're at prayer and it's not intentional. To intentionally start thinking about other things when someone's speaking to us is rude. Someone usually looks at us and says, are you listening to me? Like, we're not listening. We're hearing them go, wah, 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 like the parents in the Peanut cartoons, When we think about other things, that's no small matter. It's important to try to keep our thoughts focused. It's no small fault to avoid a person who loves us. You know how much the Lord loves us and how much sometimes we avoid prayer. We could even be at prayer and still be avoiding prayer, avoiding listening to God. That's quite possible. People do it. It's quite rude to look for someone else to talk to when someone's trying to speak to us. You know, you've been in a group of people and there's one person kind of half listening and looks around and goes, hey, goes, talks to somebody else and kind of blows you off as you're not being important. This will happen in prayer where God's trying to speak to us and we go off looking for somebody else to talk to. You know, somewhat rude about that. It's somewhat rude to imagine ourselves somewhere other than with the person we're with, or with somebody, and we're somebody, particularly someone who loves us like God, and we're dreaming about being somewhere else doing something else. There's a certain rudeness to that. There's a certain humanness to it, in reality, that, because we're broken and so forth, then okay, it's understandable. But when it's intentional and we don't take the steps to work against the nature, the fallen part of our nature, it becomes somewhat problematic. We do this to God, and we don't think twice about it. The contemplative aspect of our lives is to undo the rudeness of our fallen and broken human nature. To undo the rudeness of our fallen and broken human nature. The contemplative dimension of our life is to provide God with the time and our attention so that he may communicate with us. So it's to provide God with the time and to provide God with our attention so that he may communicate with us. So that's the beauty of our life. The beauty of the 7 hours of the divine office, the beauty of the daily rosary, the beauty of those 2 hours of quiet, the beauty of the rule on silence, is so that God has the room to communicate to us and with us. So we ask the question, how am I doing with the contemplative dimension of our life? Am I seeking the company of God or of others when it's time for silence? Am I looking for the laity? Am I looking for solitude? When it's not apostolic time, am I looking for apostolate? When it's not fraternity time, am I looking to talk? And I'm not saying when you need to talk, and those realities, those times you need to have somebody to talk to, and you got to get stuff off your chest, and you got to share. That's understandable. I'm talking about times like which is quiet, and it's just we're trying to run away from the quiet because God's trying to call us into it, and we're trying to push him away a bit. That's what we're talking about here. Am I reverencing other people's silence? That's a good question, right? Am I reverencing other people's silence? Do I recognize the fact that this person wants to be quiet, and I keep going, hey, guess what? And they want to be probably with God. I just want to, chit chat about nothing without a necessity, right? I could be disturbing their need for quiet and silence. Am I a church mouse, or am I a bull in a china closet? I often reflect upon how one of the sevenfold gifts, one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit is gentleness. Gentleness also creates the environment of quiet. We're doing something around a particular area that doesn't require a loud noise. Some things do, but this doesn't. We just do it kind of without gentleness. We make such noise that we disturb the silence for others, right? I'm not talking about stuff that requires noise, like hammering and putting things together that you have to do. I'm talking about things that just, banging things around because you're not being gentle about it. It could affect the quiet of those around us and not allow them to enter into the quiet, right? The question, am I still within myself quiet? Am I still physically? Am I still emotionally? Am I still in my mind, in my heart? Am I able to still my senses, just be that peaceful quiet, bring it to a stillness? That just stillness. Like you've been on a lake when the lake's just still. There's no wind or anything, and the water is calm. It's just so perfectly still that it reflects the beauty of the stars. I had this beautiful experience one time being in Nova Scotia, where in the middle of the night, a full moon, all these stars out, and the water was so still as we're canoeing across it. And it was just like canoeing through the stars. It was so still that the water was just reflecting the beauty of the stars. That's where we want to get to inside. We want to get to that stillness inside ourselves where we're reflecting the beauty of the stars. So am I desirous of solitude? Or am I afraid of being alone? Am I running away from being alone? Do I avoid being alone? Do I still not like being with this person? Does the person in the mirror still scare me? Do I still not like that person in the mirror? I want to be alone with that person and actually deal with what that person's going to deal with. Allow this stuff to come up and bring that person before God, right? So outside of talk time, do I talk unnecessarily? Do I look for things to talk about? So many questions we could be asking ourselves, but the primary question is whether or not I want to be intimate lover of God. That's the ultimate question. Do I want to be an intimate lover of God? Intimacy requires silence. Intimacy requires alone time. Intimacy requires privacy. Intimacy requires solitude with the beloved. Without the contemplative aspect of our life, we can be friends of God, mostly acquaintances of God. We may be able to become a best friend to God even. But without that contemplative aspect of our life, we'll never become intimate lovers of God. We'll never get to that point of being intimate lovers. We will never reach that holiness of life, that holiness of life that each and every one of us are called to. You know, we all look at those Capuchin pictures, those Capuchin saints, and you see each and every one of them. And one thing continuous about each of them were deep contemplatives. Each of them were intimate lovers of God. Each of them drank deep from that quiet and that solitude, able to be still before him. Our Holy Seraphic Father St. Francis was a man who loved prayer. He loved solitude. He loved the quiet. He loved being alone with God. Yes, he loved the apostle. Yes, he loved being with the brothers. Yes, he was a man of community. Yes, he was a man of fraternity. But first and foremost, he was able to be all those things because he was first and foremost an intimate lover of God. You and I are called to that same intimacy. We are sons of our Seraphic Father St. Francis. We bear that charism. We bear that spiritual DNA in our souls. And so we're called to that same depth of holiness with God, to be alone with him, to enjoy him, to enjoy his presence. You know? So I encourage you to look to our Capuchin charism, look to the beauty of our life, embrace the Capuchin charism, embrace the Capuchin dimension of our life. Don't fear the rules and regulations of prayer. If we give ourselves freely to it, lovingly to it, we will receive that freedom of self-gift and be able to have the room necessary to be those intimate lovers of God. May God bless you and may He keep you. Amen.